There is something you have never questioned, not because you are incurious, not because you are unintelligent, but because it is so close to you, so woven into the fabric of every moment of your experience, that questioning it has never seemed like an option. It is the assumption that what you see is what is real, that the world in front of your eyes, the solid objects, the separate people, the distances between things, the boundaries that divide you from everything else, is the actual nature of reality. This assumption is so deep, so automatic, so completely invisible to ordinary awareness, that most human beings live and die without ever once examining it. And here is what makes this extraordinary. 3 of the most sophisticated systems of knowledge ever developed by human beings, separated by thousands of years, thousands of miles, and radically different methods of investigation, arrived at the same conclusion about this assumption. They all said it is wrong, not partially wrong, not wrong in some peripheral or technical sense, wrong at the root. The ancient Egyptians built their entire civilization, their temples, their mystery schools, their elaborate maps of the soul, around the understanding that the world of ordinary perception is a veil, a necessary veil, perhaps, but a veil nonetheless. The Vedic tradition of ancient India developed over thousands of years one of the most precise and rigorous philosophical investigations of the nature of reality ever conducted. And at the center of that investigation was a single Sanskrit word, Maya, usually translated as illusion, but meaning something far more specific and far more interesting than that simple translation suggests. And then in the 20th century, something extraordinary happened. A group of physicists working with mathematics and laboratory equipment, with no interest in ancient mysticism, with every professional incentive to arrive at conventional conclusions, began to discover something that stopped them in their tracks. The solid, separate, independently existing world that common sense assumes to be real does not appear to exist at that level of analysis. What they found instead was something that sounded, to their considerable discomfort, remarkably like what the ancient traditions had been saying for thousands of years. Tonight, we are going to follow that thread from the mystery schools of ancient Egypt to the forests of the Vedic seers, to the laboratories of the 20th century's most radical physicists. Because what they all found, what the thread leads to when you follow it all the way, is not frightening. It is not nihilistic. It is not the destruction of meaning. It is something that will change the way you experience every moment of your life, if you allow it to. Let us begin in ancient Egypt, because Egypt is where this story is oldest, and because the Egyptian understanding of reality was more sophisticated, more precise, more detailed, more experientially grounded than most people have been told. The Egypt that survives in popular culture is an Egypt of tombs and treasures, of mummies and monuments, of spectacular architecture and mysterious hieroglyphs. But the Egypt that the initiates of the mystery schools inhabited was something else entirely. It was a civilization, organized at its deepest level around a single question: what is the nature of what is real? The Egyptian concept of none, the primordial waters, the infinite undifferentiated field of potential that the Egyptians place at the origin of all creation, is not a myth in the dismissive sense that the modern world uses that word. It is a description of something that the initiated priests of Memphis and Heliopolis had investigated directly. Through decades of practice, through precise methods of inner inquiry, through the experiences that the dark chambers of their temples were specifically designed to produce. None was their word for what lies beneath the surface of the visible world, not a supernatural realm separate from this one, but the ground of this one, the field of pure, undifferentiated awareness, formless, boundless, prior to all distinction, from which all forms arise and into which all forms eventually return. The God Atum, the first self-created being, was understood to emerge from none, not as a being separate from it, but as the first self-aware movement within it. The word atom itself means both everything and nothing, both the totality of existence and the void from which it emerges. This is not mythology. This is phenomenology. This is the description of something encountered in direct experience by human beings who had been trained over years and decades to look beneath the surface of ordinary perception. And what they found beneath that surface was not emptiness in the nihilistic sense. It was fullness, a fullness so total, so complete, so saturated with what the Egyptians called Heka, the fundamental creative power of reality, that the forms of the ordinary world appeared, by comparison, as something like shadows on a wall. The Greek philosopher Plato, who studied in Egypt according to the ancient sources for 13 years, later described this in his famous allegory of the cave. People chained in a cave, watching shadows on a wall, mistaking the shadows for reality. And the philosopher, the one who has turned around and seen the source of the light, returning to tell the others what he has seen. Plato did not invent this metaphor. He brought it back from Egypt. And what he brought back, what the Egyptian mystery schools had been teaching for thousands of years before he arrived, was the foundational insight that would later appear independently in a tradition on the other side of the world. The Vedic tradition of ancient India is one of the oldest living bodies of knowledge on earth. Its roots extend back at least 4,000 years, and some scholars, examining the astronomical references embedded in the oldest Vedic hymns, have argued for a much earlier origin. But what matters for our purposes tonight is not its age. What matters is what it found. The central philosophical achievement of the Vedic tradition, the understanding that emerged from centuries of rigorous investigation by the rishis, the ancient seers who composed the Upanishads, can be stated in a single sentence. That sentence is this: Brahman is the only reality, and Atman, the deepest self, the witness of all experience, is identical with Brahman. Let us unpack this carefully, because it is easy to hear these words and nod and miss entirely what they are actually saying. Brahman is the Vedic word for the infinite, self-aware ground of all existence. Not a god in the personal sense, not a being separate from the world who created it from outside, but the very substance of reality itself, the awareness that underlies and pervades all phenomena. Maya, the word we mentioned at the beginning, is the Vedic description of the mechanism by which the infinite appears as the finite, by which the one appears as many, by which the undivided appears as a world of separate objects and separate selves. Maya is not illusion in the sense of something that does not exist. It exists. The world you see is real at its own level of reality, but it is not real in the way it appears to be. The objects you see are not independently existing things, standing alone in empty space, with sharp boundaries dividing them from each other and from you. They are, according to the Vedic analysis, more like waves on the surface of an ocean. Each wave appears to be separate. Each wave has its own shape, its own height, its own movement. But each wave is, at a more fundamental level, simply the ocean expressing itself in a particular form. The wave is real, but the apparent independence of the wave, its apparent separateness from the ocean and from every other wave, is Maya. The great philosopher Adi Shankaracharya, who lived in the 8th century CE and who is considered the most systematic expositor of what became known as Advaita Vedanta, non-dual philosophy, described this with extraordinary precision. He said, "The world is neither real nor unreal. It appears to be real. It has the quality of appearing. But when it is fully investigated, when the nature of the observer and the observed are examined with sufficient precision, the apparent multiplicity resolves into a single, undivided, self-aware field. This is not a belief. This is not a doctrine to be accepted on faith. The Vedic tradition is emphatic on this point. This understanding is available to direct verification. It can be confirmed in experience. It has been confirmed repeatedly by human beings who have gone far enough in the investigation of the nature of their own awareness. And here is where the story takes its most extraordinary turn. Because 2,500 years after the Vedic rishis wrote the Upanishads, a group of scientists working in laboratories in Europe and America began to discover something that sounded, against all their expectations, very much like what those ancient seers had described. The story of quantum physics is one of the strangest in the history of human knowledge, because quantum physics did not set out to challenge the nature of reality. It set out to understand the behavior of very small things. Electrons, photons, the constituents of atoms. It was, at its origin, a highly technical enterprise with no philosophical pretensions. And then gradually, through a series of experiments whose results were so consistently strange that they could not be ignored, quantum physics found itself in territory that its founders had not anticipated. Territory that looked, to several of them, very much like the territory the ancient traditions had been mapping for thousands of years. Let us start with the experiment that changed everything. The double-slit experiment is one of the most replicated and most mysterious experiments in the history of science. Its results have been confirmed thousands of times in laboratories around the world under conditions of extraordinary rigor. Here is what happens. You fire a stream of particles, electrons for example, at a barrier with two narrow slits in it. On the other side of the barrier is a detection screen that records where each particle lands. If electrons behaved like little bullets, like solid, independently existing objects moving through empty space, you would expect them to pass through one slit or the other and create two distinct bands on the detection screen. That is not what happens. When no one is observing which slit the electron passes through, the electrons behave as waves. They produce an interference pattern on the screen, the kind of overlapping ripple pattern that you see when you drop two stones into a pond. This means that each electron impossibly passes through both slits simultaneously. It exists between the moment of emission and the moment of detection, not as a particle in a definite location, but as a wave of probability spread across multiple possible states at once. Now here is where it becomes truly extraordinary. When scientists place a detector at the slits, when they attempt to observe which slit the electron actually passes through, something happens that has no explanation within the ordinary framework of reality. The interference pattern disappears. The electrons begin to behave like particles again. Each one passes through one slit or the other. The wave-like behavior vanishes. The act of observation, the presence of a measuring device, changes the behavior of the electron. This is not a limitation of the measuring equipment. It is not a technical problem to be solved with better instruments. It is a fundamental feature of the way reality operates at the quantum level. The physicist Werner Heisenberg, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, wrote about this with remarkable candor. He said that what quantum physics had discovered was not a description of nature as it is in itself, but a description of nature as it responds to our methods of questioning. The electron does not have a definite position until it is measured. Before measurement, it exists as a superposition, a simultaneous presence in multiple possible states. What collapses the superposition into a single definite reality? The act of observation. This is the measurement problem of quantum physics. It has never been solved. It remains, after a century of the most sophisticated scientific investigation in human history, an open question. And the reason it has never been solved within the conventional scientific framework is perhaps because it is pointing towards something that the conventional scientific framework was not designed to accommodate, something that the Vedic tradition had a word for, something that the Egyptian mystery schools had spent thousands of years investigating: the irreducible role of awareness in the structure of reality. Let us pause here, because this is the point at which many people, understandably, become uncomfortable. The idea that consciousness plays a fundamental role in the nature of reality sounds, to the modern mind, like wishful thinking, like an attempt to smuggle spirituality in through the back door of science, like the kind of claim that gets made by people who want science to confirm their beliefs rather than challenge them. So let us be precise. We are not saying that your thoughts create reality in some simple, direct sense. We are not saying that if you believe hard enough, the world will rearrange itself to match your desires. What we are saying, what the evidence from quantum physics actually points toward, and what the ancient traditions described with careful precision, is something more subtle and more radical than that. We are saying that the categories through which ordinary experience organizes reality, the sharp boundary between self and world, between observer and observed, between the one who is looking and the thing being looked at, may not be features of reality itself. They may be features of a particular mode of perception, a particular, limited, extraordinarily useful mode of perception, the mode that allows us to navigate the physical world, to build things, to plan, to survive. But a mode that is not identical with reality as it actually is. The physicist Niels Bohr, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on atomic structure and who spent the last decades of his life thinking about the philosophical implications of quantum mechanics, said something that is worth sitting with. He said, "Anyone who is not shocked by quantum theory has not understood it." He was not speaking about the mathematics. He was speaking about what the mathematics implies. What it implies is that the world of solid, separate, independently existing objects, the world that common sense takes for granted, is not the fundamental level of reality. At the fundamental level, what physics finds is not objects. It finds fields, interconnected, overlapping, mutually influencing fields of energy and information, in which the sharp boundaries between things dissolve, in which the distinction between observer and observed becomes blurred, in which what looks like a collection of separate things turns out to be, at a deeper level, a single system. The physicist David Bohm, one of the most philosophically serious physicists of the 20th century, and a close collaborator of Albert Einstein, developed a framework he called the implicate order. The idea is this: what we see in ordinary experience, the world of separate objects moving through space and time, is what Bohm called the explicate order, the unfolded level of reality. But beneath it, enfolded within it, generating it, sustaining it, is a deeper level of reality in which everything is already connected, in which the apparent separateness of things is a local phenomenon, a surface feature rather than an ultimate truth. Bohm said, and he said this explicitly, with full awareness of what he was doing, that this implicate order was not unrelated to what the ancient philosophical and mystical traditions had been pointing toward. He said it sounded like what the Vedic tradition called Brahman, a physicist, one of the most rigorous minds of the 20th century, saying that the deepest level of reality that his physics was pointing toward sounded like what the ancient seers of India had described thousands of years before. This is not a coincidence. This is a convergence, and it demands to be taken seriously. Now we need to ask the question that all of this is pointing toward. If the world is not what it appears to be, if the solid, separate reality of ordinary experience is more like Maya than like bedrock, then what does that mean for you? Not philosophically, not abstractly, for you, right now, in the actual experience of your actual life. Because this is where the ancient traditions become most relevant and most misunderstood. The Vedic teaching of Maya is frequently interpreted as a reason for detachment, for withdrawal from the world, for the conclusion that, because the world is illusory, it does not matter, and therefore neither does anything that happens in it. This interpretation is wrong, and the greatest teachers of the Vedic tradition have always been emphatic about this. Maya does not mean that the world is unimportant. It does not mean that suffering does not matter, that love does not matter, that beauty does not matter. It means something far more specific. It means that the self you believe yourself to be, the self that feels separate from everything else, bounded by your skin, isolated in your private interior, is not the whole truth of what you are. It means that the anxiety that comes from believing yourself to be a small, vulnerable, isolated entity in a large, indifferent universe is based on a misperception, not a moral failing, not a sign of weakness, not something to be ashamed of, a misperception, a natural, understandable, extraordinarily pervasive misperception, built into the very structure of the ordinary human mind. The Egyptian initiates had a word for the experience of seeing through this misperception. They called it the opening of the eye of Horus, the moment when the initiate's perception expanded beyond the ordinary boundaries of self and recognized something that had always been present but had been hidden by the veil of ordinary experience. The Vedic tradition called the same recognition moksha, liberation, not liberation from the world, but liberation from the misunderstanding about the nature of the world and of the self. And here is the crucial thing. Both traditions were absolutely clear that this recognition was not reserved for monks and mystics and people who had spent decades in meditation caves. It was the natural birthright of every human being. The Upanishads say this again and again, in different ways, with different images, with the insistence of teachers who know that their students keep missing the point. You are already that. You have always been that. The recognition you are seeking is not something you need to acquire from outside yourself. It is the recognition of what you have always already been. Tattvamasi, that art thou. 3 words. One of the most concentrated expressions of philosophical insight in the history of human thought. You, the awareness reading these words right now, are identical with the ground of all existence. Not metaphorically, not as a comforting belief, as a fact about the nature of awareness that is available to direct verification. And the moment that verification occurs, in whatever form it takes, however suddenly or gradually it arrives, the relationship with the world does not end, it deepens. Because when you are no longer contracted into the fearful stance of the isolated self, always defending its boundaries, always managing its vulnerability, the world becomes available to you in a way it has never been before. Not as a threat to be managed, as an expression of what you are. If you have followed this conversation all the way to this point, if you have sat with the Egyptian understanding of none, with the Vedic teaching of Maya and Brahman, with the quantum physicists' discovery that the observer cannot be separated from the observed, then something may have shifted in you. Not a dramatic shift, perhaps just a loosening, a slight relaxation of the grip that the ordinary sense of self maintains on experience. A moment of wondering, and that wondering, that slight opening, is not nothing. It is in fact exactly what the ancient traditions were trying to produce. Not through argument alone, not through the accumulation of information, but through the gradual expansion of the horizon of what seems possible. Because here is what the ancient teachers understood about human beings. We do not transform through information. We transform through recognition. The difference is crucial. Information is something you add to what you already know. You file it away, you process it, you integrate it into your existing framework of understanding. It changes what you think, but it does not necessarily change what you are. Recognition is something else. Recognition is the moment when something you have always known, but have somehow forgotten, or have never been shown in a form you could receive, suddenly becomes undeniable. It does not feel like learning something new. It feels like remembering something ancient. The Vedic tradition has a specific word for this: pratyabhijna, recognition. The tradition of Kashmir Shaivism, one of the most sophisticated, non-dual philosophical schools in human history, understood the entire spiritual journey not as a process of acquiring something new, but as a process of recognizing what has always been present. The Egyptian hieroglyph for the concept of returning to the source, for the soul's journey back to what the Egyptians called the primordial state, was an image of a path that ends where it began, not a circle of futility, a circle of completion. You begin in the wholeness of none, the infinite, undivided field of awareness. You descend into the world of form. You navigate the territory of apparent separation, And then, through whatever path, in whatever lifetime, in whatever form the recognition finally arrives, you return. Not to somewhere you have never been, to somewhere you have always been. And the world does not disappear when this recognition arrives. The coffee is still hot, the conversations still happen, the relationships still matter, the work still has to be done. But all of it, every single moment of ordinary life, is now experienced from a different ground, from the ground of knowing what you actually are. And that difference, the difference between experiencing life from the contracted stance of the isolated, frightened self and experiencing it from the open, stable ground of what the traditions call the true self, is not a small difference. It is the difference between a life lived in reaction and a life lived in freedom. At Sacred Flame, this is what we are here for. Not to give you more information, to point at what is already present. Every video we make is another angle on the same recognition, another approach to the same territory, another attempt to say in a slightly different way what the Egyptian priests and the Vedic seers and the quantum physicists were all pointing toward. Subscribe if this work matters to you, because what is coming is more specific, more direct, more practically oriented toward the actual experience of this recognition in the middle of an ordinary human life. And share this with someone who is ready for it. You know who they are. We began tonight by asking you to examine an assumption so deep that it had never seemed like an assumption. The assumption that what you see is what is real. We followed that question through three traditions: the mystery schools of ancient Egypt, the philosophical investigations of the Vedic seers, and the laboratory discoveries of the 20th century's most radical physicists. And we found at the end of each path something that points in the same direction. The world of solid, separate, independently existing objects. The world that ordinary perception takes for granted is not the fundamental level of reality. Beneath it, generating it, sustaining it, pervading it, is something else. The Egyptians called it none, the field of undifferentiated potential from which all form arises. The Vedic tradition called it Brahman, the infinite, self-aware ground of all existence. The physicists called it the quantum field, the implicate order, the wave function before collapse. Different words, different methods, different centuries and civilizations, the same recognition. And here is what that recognition means for you, personally, practically, in the texture of your actual daily experience. It means that the isolation you feel is not the final truth about your situation. It means that the anxiety that comes from believing yourself to be a small, separate, vulnerable entity in a large and indifferent universe is based on a map of reality that is incomplete, not wrong in every respect, not useless. The ordinary sense of self is an extraordinarily useful instrument for navigating the physical world, but it is not the whole truth, and the part that it leaves out. The part that the Egyptian initiates spent years in dark temple chambers trying to recover, that the Vedic seers encoded in thousands of pages of some of the most precise philosophical writing in human history, that the quantum physicists stumbled upon in their laboratories with something between exhilaration and vertigo, is available to you, not as a distant possibility, not as something reserved for saints and mystics, as the most immediate, most present, most undeniable fact of your existence. The awareness, reading these words right now, the simple, clear, unadorned fact of being aware is not inside your skull. Your skull is inside it. The world is not outside your consciousness. Your consciousness is what the world is arising in. This is not a metaphor. This is not a poetic way of saying something that could be said more precisely in scientific language. This is the most precise thing that can be said about the nature of what is actually happening in every moment of experience. And the moment this is recognized, not believed, not hoped for, not intellectually assented to, but actually recognized in the same way that you recognize a face you have known all your life. Everything changes, not the circumstances of your life, the ground from which you meet those circumstances. The ancient traditions were not offering you a belief system to replace the one you already have. They were offering you a direct investigation, a turning of attention back toward its own source, a recognition of what has always been present, hidden not by distance, not by difficulty, not by unworthiness, but only by the habit of looking everywhere except here. The illusion you live in is not a prison. It is a veil. And veils, unlike prison walls, can be seen through. You already have everything you need to see through it. You always have. Until next time, stay awake.